How will we address the climate crisis? Climate One with Greg Dalton brings together advocates, influencers, and policymakers in empowering conversations that connect all aspects of the climate emergency, the individual and the systemic, the scary and the exciting, to help you understand the most critical issue of our time. Because addressing the climate crisis begins by talking about it.
The lack of affordable housing in the U.S. has contributed to a crisis and forced people to move farther away from urban centers where it's cheaper to build new units. Inevitably, that increases car travel and emissions. How do we address the housing and climate crises at the same time and do so equitably? Join the conversation with California State Senator Scott Wiener as we unpack the connections between housing, climate, and justice. Today on Climate One.
I think it's fair to say when people think of housing and climate, they might think about these days heat pumps or perhaps methane cooktops and induction cook stoves. But how is new housing construction a climate issue?
I mean, of course, we want all of our buildings, and particularly new ones, to be decarbonized and to have a lower carbon footprint in and of themselves. It's very important. But even more important is having housing that's located in a place where people don't have to drive everywhere, commute long hours, where people can drive less, or if they choose not drive at all, have access to public transportation, be close to where they go to school, where they work, go to the gym, and so forth. That's how we really reduce our carbon footprint, because transportation is a massive aspect of carbon emissions. In California, it's almost half. And so if we're serious about reducing carbon emissions, we got to have a more sustainable land use pattern in terms of where we're putting housing.
Right, and most of the curves in California on climate are going in a positive direction, down if they're bad things, and vehicle-wise travel is the one thing that's getting away from California.
Absolutely, we're not doing enough, first of all, to support public transportation, but because we make it so hard to get housing approved in the places where we want it, in infill housing, near jobs, near transit, in existing communities, we make it so hard and expensive. The easiest place to put housing is where there are no neighbors, or very few, which means sprawl, which means destroying open space, destroying sensitive habitat, building in wildfire zones, building further and further and further out where there are fewer people to complain about the housing. And that is very destructive environmentally.
2/3 of residential land in California had been restricted to single-family homes that have been off-limits to the development of backyard houses. A law you authored changed that, yet it hasn't opened up a whole lot of new supply. So why is it so hard to build affordable housing in the world's 5th largest economy?
Well, in terms of zoning, you're right. The large majority of land in California was zoned only for single-family homes. And what that means, just to put it in totally plain English, means every other kind of housing was banned. It didn't used to be that way until like 50 years ago. You could build apartment buildings in a lot of different places. And then starting in the 70s into the 80s, cities methodically banned apartment buildings and said only single family homes. So only one unit of housing per parcel, which creates a math problem. And it also completely induced sprawl, and people knew at the time.
And racial filtering,
yes.
Let's be honest.
And single-family zoning was invented about 100 years ago after the Supreme Court struck down racial zoning. Communities, starting with Berkeley, discovered, well, if we can't explicitly ban people of color, but what we can do is make it impossible for anyone who's not upper income to live here. And so they said you can only build single family homes. So we did pass, well, first we really strengthened our existing law to allow for in-law units, or what we call an accessory dwelling unit. And that, it took a while, but that's now exploding. We're seeing up and down the state, these accessory units are being built in increasing numbers. A couple of years ago, we passed legislation led by our Senate President, Senator Tony Atkins from San Diego, to basically eliminate single-family zoning, and to have duplex zoning or 2 to 4 units. It's only been in effect for a year. Development never moves as fast as we want, so people are worrying that it's not producing enough, but it'll get there. It just takes time.
Okay, so granny units or in-law units will get there, yet when it's still cheaper to build outside of cities, further from jobs and amenities, how do you address climate and the justice and equity issues at the same time?
Yeah, well, we need to make it easier and easier to build in sustainable locations, infill housing in existing communities, near jobs, near schools, near public transportation, and that's what we're trying to do, because right now we've set up a system that's designed to fail, a system that empowers. I'm a former local elected official. I'm a former neighborhood association president. I believe in public input and people having a stake in their own community and having the right to have an opinion about their own community. But we've gone so far beyond that we have endless process that can take years and years and years, even if you're building within all the rules. In addition, we have empowered obstructionists who are not typically representative, right? Most people don't even know that this public hearing is happening. They're working, they're trying to get their kids to do their homework, they're putting dinner on the table, and you have people who may or may not be representative of the community at large, but they have the ability to show up at 1 million community meetings and to file appeals, and we've given them the tools to obstruct, delay, kill these projects, and that needs to change.
Because some people say that housing is an example where NIMBYs in progressive areas have captured regulators, something that liberals often accuse people on the right and corporations of doing, but NIMBYism is sort of regulatory capture from the left. So what's the solution?
Well, first of all, I don't think NIMBYism is left. True progressivism is not NIMBYism. And so I think you have people in the blue areas, like parts of California and other parts of the country, who they might have a Bernie Sanders sign on their lawn or a Black Lives Matter sign on their lawn or a big rainbow flag unfurled, which is great, but they are at the same time acting in a very, very conservative way by saying, I don't want any change in my community, and I'm worried about the quote-unquote kind of people who are going to come here, who are going to somehow quote-unquote degrade my community. If showing up at a planning commission or a city council development appeal in a blue area sometimes it doesn't sound that different from a red area in terms of the things that come out of people's mouths. And things that it's shocking to hear people say. And I get it, people are very passionate about their neighborhood. I completely respect that. But sometimes we need to be forward thinking and saying, hey, maybe it'll be a little bit harder for me to park. Maybe there will be a view that I've had for a long time that isn't quite as good anymore. But more people are going to be able to live here, that there will be a prayer for the next generation to have a place to live. Maybe fewer people will be living in their cars. Maybe we won't have 5% of San Francisco Unified School District. 5% of those kids are homeless. And that's consistent and probably an undercount statewide. That we have families who are literally waking up in a homeless shelter or a car, dropping their kids off from school, going to work. And so that's what this is about. And so I think NIMBYism is inherently very conservative, even if you're registered as a Democrat.
California has a statewide goal of reaching 2.5 million new housing units by 2030, 1 million of which must be affordable. New housing construction has fallen behind demand for decades, and for decades, cities and counties have not met their goals and not much has happened. Now those jurisdictions face financial penalties for not meeting state mandated levels of new housing. Will the hammer get the job done?
I think it will move us in a very good direction. And when we see what's happening in the last 6 or 8 years, where we've really been putting teeth into longstanding state housing law in California and passing new laws, and it has, I think it's gradually working. And we look at in San Francisco, the Board of Supervisors just adopted what we call a housing element. And a housing element in California is every 8 years, a city has to put together a housing plan, incorporating numbers of new homes that the state provides. And you have to plan for how you're going to meet those housing goals in the next 8 years. And historically, the process has been sort of a joke. I went through it when I was on the Board of Supervisors. It was very controversial, but ultimately it's like a document that sits on a shelf collecting dust. The housing element process now, it has teeth in it. And San Francisco just adopted a new housing element to plan for 82,000 homes. It's a very, very strong plan. I want to commend our planning department and the Board of Supervisors and the mayor and everyone who made this happen. But that happened because the people in our city government who want to do the right thing now had the leverage to do it, because the hammer of state law was out there, that if the city adopted a bad housing plan or didn't adopt one on time, there would be all sorts of consequences. And cities up and down the state are seeing that, and a lot of them are trying to do the right things, and the ones that don't do the right thing are going to have consequences.
And so that's 2 to 3 times the amount of annual production that San Francisco and Bay Area.
3 times.
Yeah, three times. Yeah. So is that going to make the NIMBYs not be NIMBYs?
No. What we found is that even when you streamline housing approvals, and if there are cities that want to fight it, they'll try to find loopholes. With in-law units, for years, cities were technically required to allow people to put in-law units in their homes. Cities ignored it. They found all sorts of loopholes. It took us like 5 or 6 laws that we passed. We finally, I think, sealed off every loophole, and now it's just sort of happening. And unfortunately, and there are certain cities that have showed us the way, like they've been so obstructionist that they unearth every loophole, which I really appreciate. Cupertino did a great job of that, where Apple is headquartered. They unearthed every loophole, and so we would close the loopholes based on what they discovered. And they now have a new city council that's a lot better, so that's a good thing.
Transit-oriented development has been talked about for a long time, aims to build housing near transportation hubs. I recently drove around near the BART station in Concord, a city of 130,000 people, 30 miles from San Francisco. There were empty lots near the regional BART commuter rail station. Also blocks of housing, 4 to 5 stories tall. It's like, okay, I can see kind of things happening here. Yet building on parking lots near that commuter rail is highly controversial. Some say housing is a higher use of that land, and others say removing parking hurts working class people who can't afford to live close by because housing prices are so high. So how do you balance that?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, when you look at it, like the BART system in the Bay Area, we have all these BART stations where we make public investments, and very few people live within walking distance. It's people who live in single-family homes who are privileged to have been able to afford those homes right by the BART station. And so the idea is to also allow for apartment buildings, particularly, BART has a lot of land around the stations to put apartment buildings there. And we actually, a few years ago, we passed a law authorizing BART to approve its own projects within certain constraints. It was very controversial. We felt that it was important because some of the cities that have BART stations were just refusing to allow it. We want to make sure that there's mixed income. These are mixed income developments, that it's either some will be 100% affordable or mixed income with market rate and below market rate mixed together, which is great to have mixed income developments. We want to make sure that people of all incomes can live there. There's also nothing that would stop BART, instead of having, if you think about it, these massive parking lots, that surface parking lots, if you replace that, most of it for housing, you can still they can create a parking structure if they want. There's nothing stopping them from doing that, so that people who are, still have the ability to drive in if they don't live anywhere nearby. So there's nothing stopping BART from having that kind of mixed use.
When you were last here on this stage at Climate One, you talked about seeing waves of people forced out of your own neighborhood. You also said that new housing construction in Washington, D.C. and New York had reduced rents in those cities. Yet lower rents and displacement can happen at the same time. Rents can soften and people can still be displaced. So what needs to be done to ensure that new development doesn't increase displacement?
Yeah, I think that we have to be very clear that the cause of displacement is not having enough homes. When you have a shortage of homes, there's competition, the prices go up, and we know what happens, and we know who tends to be the winners and who tends to be the losers. And lower income, working class people tend to draw the short end of the straw when you have a shortage of homes. And so, for example, we about 9 years ago, we had a big fight about whether to have a moratorium on new housing in the Mission. And there were advocates in the Mission who were pushing for that because they were very concerned that new construction was going to push out.
I was going to say, this is a historically Hispanic part of San Francisco.
Yeah. And what they pointed to correctly was that over the last 10 or 15 years, something like 8,000 Latino families had left the Mission. And while some of those families no doubt left because they went and maybe bought a home in the Excelsior or went to Daly City, there were clearly a significant number of Latino families that had been pushed out of the Mission. But if you look at housing construction over that same, I forget, 10 or 15 year time period, almost no new housing had been built in the Mission. If you ranked San Francisco neighborhoods for that time period, the Mission was very close to the bottom in housing production. That's changed over the last decade. But at that time, we were seeing massive displacement in the Mission with almost no new housing being built. And that is because the Mission is an amazing neighborhood. It is central, it's great weather, it has good transit, it is a beautiful, wonderful neighborhood. And a lot of people wanted to live there. And that jacked up the rents and it gave landlords incentives to evict people and all that. And so that having a shortage of housing is the core driver of displacement. You can have a bad situation where you allow for new housing where you're demolishing old housing and displacing people, and that's why new development needs to be accompanied by anti-displacement strategies, like not knocking down apartment buildings where people are living just to replace it. And in the narrow circumstances where it does make sense to replace a building, taking care of the people who are there by giving them temporary housing and then bringing them back paying the same rent, which we've done in some developments. We need strong renter protection so people aren't evicted. So if you combine anti-displacement strategies with adding new housing, you're not going to see that kind of displacement. You will reduce the pressure because you have all these new buildings that people can live in without having to try to displace people in other older buildings.
So there's often a formula that new construction has to be, 30% affordable? Is that enough?
First of all, you need projects to be able to pencil out. So we have publicly funded projects that are typically 100% affordable, where we use tax credits and bond financing and so forth. When you're talking about private development, San Francisco's inclusionary, the required affordability is like 20 or so, 21%. And different kinds of projects pencil in different ways. So there are some smaller projects where 21% may not be feasible for that project. Larger projects, especially projects that also maybe include office or other economic drivers, can probably support a higher percentage of affordability. And so we want to make sure we have these mixed income projects, but we also need to make sure that they pencil out financially, because you can say we want 30 or 40 or 50% affordability, but if the project doesn't pencil out, 50% of zero is still zero.
Right, it still has to attract capital to do that project, because even the state doesn't have enough money to build all of this. Yet we're still talking about $1 million a door. I mean, is it really ever going to really build enough housing when it's so bloody expensive in this area?
The cost of construction is off the charts, and it's higher in San Francisco than elsewhere. It's going to be higher. I mean, it's more expensive to do anything in a place like San Francisco or New York City, in these big cities, but it's way, way, way too expensive. And
how do we get it down?
Well, the process cost adds to that. If it takes 3, 4, 5, 7 years to get something approved instead of like 3 to 6 months, which some of the laws that we've been able to pass that streamline permits say that the city has to give the permit within 3 to 6 months, depending on the size of the project. So 3 to 6. So, for example, I'll tell you, Bridge Housing, which is the largest nonprofit affordable housing builder in California, told us that after a particular law that I authored was signed into law, SB 35, once that happened, their average time to get a permit to build dropped from an average of 7 years to an average of 4 months.
Wow.
And so when you think about it, if you have a project that goes on and on, that it's just dragging on, and appeals and lawsuits and endless process, you think about all the architects and the lawyers and the consultants and everything. That is very expensive and adds to the cost. We have a construction workforce shortage in California That drives up the cost. We want to make sure we need to train more construction workers. We have much less control over the cost of materials, and we know that construction materials have gone up in the last few years, but it is way too expensive, and it is a problem.
So prior to the pandemic, office vacancy rates in San Francisco was about 4%. Today, it's around 26. Nationally, that number is about 12%. Can cities in California around the country convert some of those empty offices to residential?
Last year, we passed legislation that facilitates commercial conversion. And that typically is going to be strip malls or office parks or sort of low rise. When we talk about downtown San Francisco, converting high rises to housing is very hard. And it can be very cost prohibitive, because if you think about how the plumbing, for example, it's very centralized, right? One bathroom per floor. It's not per unit. So you have to completely restructure the whole building. Yeah. It could work for some high rises, but for many it won't be feasible. I also just want to say, and this is just in defense of the great city of San Francisco, our obituary has been written 1 million times, and every time we come back stronger than before. Downtown is obviously going through challenging times. It is more vibrant now than it was 6 or 9 months ago. The owners of the Transamerica Pyramid are making a massive investment in that building. And I think downtown San Francisco will come back. And what I don't want to see is cannibalizing our office stock, and then all of a sudden we're back where we were in 2019, where we had a massive shortage of offices, and small businesses and nonprofits and law firms, et cetera, were getting pushed out of the city because there was no office space they could afford. So I want us to take the long view. I don't think anyone knows what office is going to look like in 3 years. Anyone who says they does, I think they're speculating. So I think we need to be very thoughtful about how we approach that.
Environmental regulations like California Environmental Quality Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, often used to slow down. They've been weaponized. Should they be reformed or relaxed in some way?
Yeah, massively. The California Environmental Quality Act is I refer to it as the law that swallowed California. This was a law that was created in the 1970s for excellent reasons. And I'm not one to say CEQA should be repealed. CEQA needs to be refocused on actually protecting the environment, and CEQA needs to be turned into a climate action law, which right now it is not. The purpose of CEQA was when you're doing something that could be potentially environmentally destructive, building a highway, building a dam, doing something that could be really harmful environmentally, that you have to analyze the environmental impacts to inform the decision maker. That's a great idea. CEQA was never intended to allow your neighbor to jack you up because you're trying to replace your windows. And right now, you can do that.
Or stop a bike lane.
Stop a bike lane, stop a bus rapid transit lane, stop an apartment building on top of a public transport, on top of a rail station. That's what CEQA, some of the things that CEQA is being used for. And or to stop UC Berkeley from admitting students. That's what a court decision ruled last year before the legislature overruled the court and changed the law. And so when you look at some of the things or to stop solar, that's used for that too. And so that is a problem. CEQA converted from an environmental law to a process law. And I'm not saying there are times when CEQA can be used to stop really bad projects, but there are a lot of good projects that either get killed or delayed and become more expensive or get chopped in half. And anyone who can hire a lawyer, you can be a CEQA player, and you can delay and stop projects, and that is government at its absolute worst. It's not democratic.
Again, CEQA is the California Environmental Quality Act. What housing and city models do you look at elsewhere? Who's getting it right? You're an expert on housing here in California. Look around the country. What do you see that's a real bright spot?
Well, I think there are cities that their rents, this is pre-pandemic, the pandemic scrambled things up a bit, that built a lot of housing and rents came down. Like Washington, D.C. was one, Chicago was another. I'm not saying they have perfect systems, but it show, and these are great, amazing cities. I'm a believer in social housing, which we used to call public housing, publicly built and run housing, typically mixed income. And we used to do that. Ronald Reagan killed it off in the 80s, which is, by the way, when homelessness started to skyrocket. That was not a coincidence. And we need to get back to significant public investment in social housing. So a group of us went to Vienna last September. And they have an amazing social housing system, but other European cities do as well as Singapore. And it's a really great model. It doesn't have to be the entire housing system. It's not about taking people's homes away, but it should be there as a bedrock just to make sure that everyone has a home and can afford a home. That should never be a question in a society about whether someone has the ability to have a home. Having a home should never be a privilege. It should be a right, but it can only be a right if we have enough homes for everyone who needs them.
Even Hong Kong, one of the most capitalistic places on the planet, has a lot of public or social housing. For how long can the California ecosystem continue to support population growth?
I don't agree that building new housing is what drives population growth. People move where they want to live.
But the lack of it can drive people out of state.
It can, but let's be clear. We stopped building housing in a meaningful way decades ago, and our population for decades continued to grow. And what that meant was we had more homelessness, we had more overcrowding in homes, and so I just don't agree that if we stop building housing, it's going to people are going to stop coming here. They're going to still come here, and even though we have in the last few years, California's population growth has plateaued and then shrunk by a tiny amount, I don't know that's going to continue.
We've been discussing housing as a climate lever with State Senator Scott Wiener. Thank you, Senator, for coming here and for your leadership on so many climate issues.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.